The crystal chandeliers of Ashworth Manor blazed like 1,000 captured stars, their light dancing across silk gowns and polished mahogany as London's finest gathered for the season's most anticipated ball. Yet amidst this carefully orchestrated beauty, Cassian Montclair, Duke of Greystone, found himself profoundly bored. He stood near the terrace doors, a glass of champagne warming untouched in his hand, watching the assembled company with the weary detachment of a man who had seen this performance too many times before. At 32, Cassian had perfected the art of appearing engaged while remaining entirely removed. His dark hair, unfashionably long by society's standards, brushed the collar of his impeccably tailored evening coat. His grey eyes, the colour of winter storm clouds, observed everything while revealing nothing. Women whispered about those eyes, about the way they seemed to see straight through pretense to truth. Men feared them for precisely the same reason. Power, Cassian had learned, was not merely about title or wealth, though he possessed both in abundance. True power lay in understanding people, their motivations, their weaknesses, their carefully guarded secrets. And tonight, those grey eyes had been tracking a particular drama unfolding across the ballroom with growing concern. Isadora Kingsley stood near the refreshment table, her posture rigid with forced composure. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that should have complemented her delicate features and highlighted the unusual amber of her eyes. Instead, the colour seemed to drain what little vitality remained in her face. Cassian had noticed her earlier in the evening, when she'd still carried herself with something resembling hope. That hope had steadily withered over the past hour, as her fiancé, Viscount Edmund Hartley, held court on the opposite side of the room, pointedly ignoring her existence. Cassian knew Edmund Hartley. Not personally, he made it a point to avoid the company of fools and scoundrels whenever possible, but he knew the type. Hartley was a second son, who had unexpectedly inherited his title when his elder brother died in a hunting accident. Convenient timing, that accident, occurring just as the elder Hartley had begun asking uncomfortable questions about Edmund's gambling debts and questionable associations. No proof of foul play had ever surfaced, but Cassian had learned to trust his instincts about men, and his instincts screamed warnings whenever Edmund Hartley entered a room. The Viscount currently stood surrounded by a group of similarly dissolute young men, his handsome face flushed with wine and self-importance. A young widow, Lady Pembroke, leaned against his arm with calculated intimacy. Edmund's hand rested on her waist with a familiarity that made Cassian's jaw tighten. This was deliberate cruelty, performed for an audience, designed to humiliate. Across the ballroom, Isadora had noticed. Of course she had noticed. How could she not, when half the assembled guests were watching with barely concealed anticipation, waiting to see how the evening's entertainment would unfold? Society loved nothing more than witnessing someone's downfall, particularly when that someone had committed the sin of being genuinely kind in a world that mistook kindness for weakness. Cassian watched Isadora's face transform as understanding dawned. Her amber eyes widened, then shuttered. Her lips, which had been pressed into a thin line of determination, began to tremble despite her obvious effort at control. Colour flooded her cheeks, then drained away completely, leaving her pale as moonlight. She set down her glass with a hand that shook visibly, and for one terrible moment, Cassian thought she might faint. Instead, she fled. The movement was so sudden, so graceless compared to the gliding steps society demanded, that it drew every eye in the room. Isadora gathered her skirts in both hands and ran toward the terrace doors, her careful composure shattering like dropped crystal. Cassian heard Edmund's laughter ring out behind her, cruel and satisfied. He heard other voices join in, the sharp tittering of people grateful that tonight's scandal belonged to someone else. Cassian moved without conscious decision, stepping aside as Isadora burst through the terrace doors into the garden beyond. She didn't see him. She saw nothing but her own humiliation, her own desperate need to escape the hundreds of eyes watching her dreams crumble in real time. Her breath came in harsh gasps that weren't quite sobs, not yet, though Cassian suspected that would change once she found a dark corner where she believed herself unobserved. He should leave her to her grief, A gentleman, his mother would have said, knows when to respect privacy. But Cassian had never been particularly good at following rules, even the unspoken ones. Besides, something about Isadora Kingsley's devastation struck a chord in him that he'd thought long since silenced. Perhaps it was the dignity she'd tried so hard to maintain. Perhaps it was the recognition that here was someone else who saw through society's gilded surface to the rot beneath. Or perhaps it was simply that Edmund Hartley's satisfied smirk had ignited a cold fury in Cassian's chest that demanded action. He remained on the terrace, giving Isadora the illusion of solitude while ensuring she was safe. The London garden at night held dangers beyond emotional ones, and despite her current state, Cassian suspected Miss Kingsley possessed too much sense to wander far in the darkness. Sure enough, after several minutes, he heard her slow, measured breaths from somewhere near the rose arbor. She was composing herself, gathering the scattered pieces of her dignity with the same determination soldiers showed while rallying after a surprise attack. Brave girl, Cassian thought. Foolish perhaps to have trusted Edmund Hartley in the first place, but brave nonetheless. He waited until her breathing steadied before stepping back inside, leaving her to whatever peace she might find in the garden's shadows. The ballroom buzzed with renewed energy, feeding on the spectacle they'd just witnessed. Edmund held court like a victor, accepting congratulations from his companions, as if publicly humiliating one's fiancée were some sort of accomplishment. Lady Pembroke preened beside him, her own reputation apparently no concern now that she'd succeeded in replacing Isadora in Edmund's attentions. Cassian caught sight of Lord Ashworth, their host, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he tried to redirect conversation toward less scandalous topics. The man's wife showed no such compunction. Lady Ashworth was already deep in whispered conference with the season's most notorious gossips, no doubt ensuring that by morning every drawing room in London would be dissecting Miss Kingsley's disgrace. The Duke moved through the crowd with practiced ease, deflecting attempts at conversation with the economy of a man whose title afforded him the luxury of rudeness when necessary. He had no desire to discuss the evening's entertainment or speculate about Miss Kingsley's future prospects. Those prospects, he knew, had just narrowed considerably. A broken engagement was scandal enough, but being publicly cast aside for another woman at a major society event, that stain would follow Isadora Kingsley for the rest of her life unless something dramatic shifted the narrative. Cassian found himself standing near Edmund's circle, though he hadn't consciously directed his steps there. The Viscount, emboldened by wine and success, failed to notice the Duke's approach until Cassian's shadow fell across their group. "Your Grace." Edmund executed a bow that managed to convey both respect and mockery. "We were just discussing the remarkable weather we've been having. Unseasonably warm for March, wouldn't you say?" The surrounding men laughed at this transparent lie. Everyone knew what they'd been discussing. Cassian regarded Edmund with the expression he typically reserved for examining specimens of particularly unappealing insects. "I would say, Hartley, that you've confused warmth with rot. An easy mistake for those who cannot distinguish between the two." Cassian kept his voice pleasant, almost conversational, but something in his tone made the nearby guests take an involuntary step backward. "Tell me, do you find it satisfying playing to an audience, or is cruelty simply your nature independent of witnesses?" Edmund's face flushed darker. "I'm sure I don't know what your Grace means." "Don't you?" Cassian took a single step forward, and Edmund instinctively retreated. "Then allow me to clarify. I've known men like you, Hartley, men who mistake callousness for strength, who believe that degrading others elevates themselves. I've also known what becomes of such men, eventually." The ballroom had grown remarkably quiet. Conversations faltered as people strained to hear the Duke of Greystone's soft, precise words. Lady Pembroke shifted uneasily, suddenly uncertain whether her prize was worth the Duke's obvious displeasure. "Miss Kingsley is your fiancée," Cassian continued, still in that dangerously mild tone. "An engagement, I believe, that was entered into with all proper formality and expectation of honor. Yet you stand here publicly flaunting your disdain for her, seeking to humiliate a young woman whose only apparent fault is having trusted your word." "Our engagement is my private affair," Edmund blustered, though his earlier confidence had noticeably diminished. With respect, Your Grace, it's hardly your concern. You made it everyone's concern when you chose this venue for your demonstration. Cassian's eyes, those winter-grey eyes that saw too much, fixed on Edmund with an intensity that made the younger man flinch. But you're correct about one thing. Your engagement is indeed your private affair. I wouldn't dream of interfering. He turned as if to leave, then paused, glancing back with an expression of mild curiosity. Though I confess myself puzzled, Hartley. Your brother's death was quite sudden, wasn't it? Just as you were facing some rather pressing financial difficulties. Fortuitous timing, one might say. Almost suspiciously so. The colour drained from Edmund's face. Around them, guests exchanged glances, heavy with speculation. Cassian had said nothing directly accusatory, nothing that could be challenged or proven. He'd merely asked a question, drawn a connection, planted a seed of doubt that would grow and spread through London's gossip network like ivy through a garden wall. "So you have no right," Edmund began, but Cassian had already walked away, leaving the Viscount to face a roomful of people whose expressions had shifted from amused to calculating. Cassian departed Ashworth Manor shortly thereafter, having accomplished what he came for, though he hadn't known his objective until the moment presented itself. As his carriage rolled through London's gaslit streets, he found his thoughts returning to Isadora Kingsley's stricken face, to the courage it must have taken for her to attend that ball, knowing her engagement was crumbling, to the dignity she'd maintained until the moment it became impossible. He thought about Edmund Hartley's satisfied cruelty, and the way society had enabled it, had anticipated it with the breathless excitement of spectators at a gladiatorial match. He thought about his own words, carefully chosen to wound and warn without crossing into actual accusation. Most of all, he thought about the strange, unexpected fury that had risen in his chest at the sight of deliberate humiliation masquerading as entertainment. Cassian Montclair had not built his power by acting impulsively. Every move he made was calculated, considered, designed to achieve specific ends. Yet as his carriage turned onto his street, he found himself already planning his next steps, already seeing the shape of a strategy that had nothing to do with political advantage or financial gain. 2 days, he decided. He would give Edmund Hartley 2 days to believe himself triumphant, to grow comfortable in his supposed victory. 2 days for London's gossips to thoroughly dissect the evening's events, and for Isadora Kingsley to understand exactly how her world had narrowed. 2 days before Cassian made his move. He smiled slightly in the darkness of his carriage, an expression that would have alarmed anyone who knew him well enough to recognize it. The Duke of Greystone had just declared war, though his opponent didn't know it yet. The Kingsley household on Portland Place was respectable, without being grand, comfortable without being ostentatious. Cassian had made it his business to learn everything he could about Isadora's family in the 2 days since the ball. Her father, Richard Kingsley, was a barrister of some reputation. Honest work, though not the sort that generated significant wealth. Her mother had died when Isadora was 12, leaving Richard to raise 2 daughters largely on his own. The younger daughter, Cecilia, was 16 and apparently possessed more practical sense than romance in her nature, unlike her elder sister. Isadora herself was 23, past the first bloom of youth by society's ruthless standards, though Cassian privately thought her age gave her features an interesting quality that dewy 18-year-olds lacked. She was educated beyond what was typical for young women, having had access to her father's extensive library and the benefit of a man who saw no reason to limit his daughter's intellectual curiosity. She read extensively, spoke 3 languages with varying degrees of fluency, and played the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than technical skill. She was also, as of 2 days ago, ruined. The story had spread exactly as Cassian had known it would. Edmund Hartley had formally broken their engagement the morning after the ball, citing irreconcilable differences and mutual agreement in a statement so transparently false that no one bothered pretending to believe it. Lady Pembroke, far from suffering any social consequences for her role in the drama, had been seen on Edmund's arm at the theatre the very next evening. The message was clear. Edmund had upgraded, and Isadora had been found wanting. Worse still were the whispers about why. Speculation ranged from the merely unkind to the genuinely vicious. Some suggested Isadora had been too cold, too intellectual, insufficiently attentive to her fiancé's needs. Others hinted at scandal, at some secret failing or impropriety that had caused Edmund to reject her. The most pernicious rumours suggested that perhaps she'd been too attentive, that Edmund had discovered her to be less than virtuous and had righteously cast her aside. None of it was true, of course. Cassian's own investigations had confirmed that Isadora Kingsley's only fault was having accepted a proposal from a man unworthy of her trust. But truth mattered less than perception in society's court, and perception was currently destroying her reputation with efficient thoroughness. Which was why, on a grey afternoon 2 days after the ball, Cassian's distinctive black carriage drew to a stop before the Kingsley residence. He'd sent no warning of his visit, no calling card preceding his arrival. The element of surprise was crucial to his plan, as was the statement made by his appearance without invitation. The Duke of Greystone did not require permission to call on anyone. His presence was the honour, his interest the privilege. The knocker on the Kingsley door was polished brass in the shape of a lion's head. Cassian lifted it and let it fall 3 times, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Curtains twitched in neighbouring windows. Servants would be reporting this development to their employers within minutes. Good. Let them watch. Let them wonder. A butler answered, his professional composure faltering as he recognized the Duke. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting—" "I've come to call on Miss Kingsley," Cassian said, handing over his card, though it was entirely unnecessary. Every servant in London knew the Duke of Greystone by sight. If she's receiving visitors— The butler's expression suggested he very much doubted Miss Kingsley was receiving anyone, particularly not unexpected dukes, but Cassian's tone left no room for refusal. "Of course, Your Grace. If you'll wait in the drawing-room, I'll inquire with Mr. Kingsley." The drawing-room was modest but well-appointed, the furniture showing signs of care rather than wealth. Books were everywhere, on shelves, stacked on tables, left open on the settee, as if their reader had only just stepped away. A pianoforte occupied one corner, its music stand currently displaying a piece by Beethoven, the margins covered in penciled notes about fingering and tempo. Fresh flowers in a simple vase brightened the mantelpiece, their cheerful colours at odds with the household's current circumstances. Cassian heard rapid footsteps in the hallway, lowered voices conferring in urgent whispers. He caught fragments of the conversation. Mr. Kingsley's surprise, someone else's concern, a young female voice insisting she would not see anyone. Then Richard Kingsley himself appeared, his weathered face showing both confusion and wary hope. "Your Grace, this is an unexpected honour." Kingsley's bow was precise, a barrister's gesture rather than a courtier's. "I confess myself uncertain what brings you to our home." "I've come to speak with your daughter, if she'll permit it." Cassian kept his voice neutral, businesslike. "I understand this is irregular, but the matter I wish to discuss is time-sensitive." "Might I ask what matter?" "You may ask, certainly, but the answer is for Miss Kingsley alone." Cassian met the older man's eyes steadily. "I mean her no harm, Mr. Kingsley. You have my word as a gentleman, inadequate as such assurances may seem given the circumstances." Richard Kingsley studied him for a long moment. Whatever he saw in Cassian's face must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "I'll ask her, but the decision is hers. She's had quite enough of men making decisions on her behalf. I would expect nothing less from your daughter, sir, and I wouldn't want it any other way." Kingsley left, and Cassian heard more whispered conversation, this time including Isadora's voice, low and strained. She was refusing as he'd anticipated. Her father was insisting she at least hear what the Duke had to say. A younger voice, Cecilia's presumably, added her own urging to her father's. Then silence. Then footsteps, measured and reluctant, approaching the drawing-room. Isadora Kingsley entered, and Cassian saw immediately how much the past 2 days had cost her. She wore a simple day dress of grey muslin, her hair pulled back in an unforgiving style that emphasized the shadows under her eyes. Those unusual amber eyes, which he remembered blazing with determination at the ball, now appeared dulled, almost extinguished. She held herself with rigid control, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles showed white. "Your Grace." Her curtsy was technically correct, but entirely perfunctory. "I cannot imagine what business you might have with me." "Can't you?" Cassian remained standing as propriety demanded in the presence of a lady. "Shall we begin with honesty, Miss Kingsley? I think we've both had quite enough of pretense." Something flickered in those amber eyes, surprise perhaps, or the faint stirring of anger, the first genuine emotion he'd seen since she entered. "Honesty. How refreshing. Very well, Your Grace. Honestly, I wish you would state your business and leave. I have no desire to extend this household's current humiliation by entertaining uninvited guests, however elevated their rank." Well said. Cassian found himself genuinely pleased by her spirit. He'd worried the past days might have broken something essential in her. "Then I'll be direct. I came because I witnessed your treatment at Ashworth Manor. I came because I know Edmund Hartley for what he is. And I came because I believe I might offer you a solution to your current difficulties, if you're willing to hear it." "A solution?" Isadora's laugh was brittle, edges sharp enough to cut. "How generous. Let me guess. You've come to offer me your protection? Your patronage? Perhaps a small cottage somewhere far from London where I might live out my scandal in comfortable obscurity." Nothing so predictable. Cassian allowed himself a slight smile. "I've come to propose marriage, Miss Kingsley, yours and mine. A real marriage, legally binding and socially unassailable. What do you say?" The color drained from Isadora's face, then flooded back in a rush. For a moment she simply stared at him as if he'd begun speaking an unknown language. Then understanding dawned, followed immediately by fury. "Get out." "I understand your reaction." "I said get out." Her voice rose, control finally shattering. "How dare you? How dare you come here to my home and mock me with such a proposal? I may be ruined, Your Grace, but I'm not so desperate that I'll accept— What? Pity? Charity? Some twisted form of amusement at my expense?" "It's none of those things." Cassian kept his voice level, refusing to match her agitation. "It's a business proposition, pure and simple, one that benefits us both, if you'll listen long enough to hear the terms." "Benefits us both," Isadora repeated, her tone acidic. "I fail to see how marrying a woman whose reputation has been shredded benefits the Duke of Greystone in any conceivable way." "Then you lack imagination, Miss Kingsley. Or perhaps you simply underestimate your own value." Cassian gestured toward the settee. "Will you sit? This conversation will be more comfortable if we're not standing across the room glaring at each other." "I don't want to be comfortable. I want you to leave." "I will. But not before you've heard what I have to say." Cassian moved to the settee himself, settling into it with the casual confidence of a man who knew his presence was a gift, not an imposition. "You may remain standing if you prefer. I'm prepared to be patient." Isadora stared at him, clearly torn between throwing him out bodily, an impossibility given their respective sizes and his rank, and the compelling curiosity that Cassian had counted on to overcome her initial resistance. Curiosity won, as it usually did with intelligent people. She perched on the edge of a chair opposite him, her posture suggesting she might bolt at any moment. "5 minutes, Your Grace. Then I'm calling my father to escort you out." 5 minutes is all I need." Cassian leaned back, deliberately casual, deliberately unthreatening. "Let me begin by telling you what I know about Edmund Hartley. His title came to him under suspicious circumstances. His finances are dire. He inherited massive debts along with that title. His associations are questionable, his habits worse. He needed money, and he needed it quickly. What does this have to do with your absurd proposal?" "Everything." Cassian's expression hardened. "For you were never his first choice, Miss Kingsley. You were his practical choice. Your dowry, while not enormous, was sufficient to keep his creditors at bay temporarily. You were respectable, educated, reasonably attractive, and young enough to provide the heir he needs. You were, in short, a solution to his problems." Isadora flinched, but her voice remained steady. "How comforting to know I was adequate to his needs. Until a better option appeared. Lady Pembroke is a widow with a substantial independent income, and no male relatives to object to how her new husband might spend it. She's also foolish enough to believe Edmund's protestations of love, and desperate enough for the status his title provides to overlook his character. She represents everything he wanted: money without conditions, admiration without demands, and most importantly, wealth he can access immediately. So I was discarded for better prospects. I had already deduced as much, Your Grace. You still haven't explained your interest in any of this. My interest, Cassian said softly, is in justice. I don't tolerate men like Edmund Hartley operating with impunity. I especially don't tolerate them using society's rules and prejudices to destroy innocent people while elevating themselves. What he did to you was calculated cruelty, performed for maximum impact. He wanted everyone to see you humiliated. He wanted your reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no one would question his decision to break your engagement. Again, why do you care? It was a fair question, and one Cassian had asked himself repeatedly over the past 2 days. The true answer was complex, rooted in his own history, and the lessons he'd learned about power's responsibilities. But he settled for a simpler truth. Because I can. Because I have the power to correct this injustice, and having that power creates an obligation to use it. And because, Miss Kingsley, I think you deserve better than the future society is currently offering you. Isadora was silent for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that reminded Cassian why he'd been drawn to her in the first place. She saw through surfaces. She sought truth beneath pretense. She was, in many ways, exactly like him. You still haven't explained how marriage to you solves anything, she finally said. If anything, it creates more scandal. The Duke of Greystone unexpectedly proposing to a woman whose engagement just ended in disaster. People would say you pitied me. They'd say I trapped you somehow, that you felt obligated by some misguided sense of chivalry. They'd be forced to reconsider their entire narrative about you. Cassian interrupted. Think about it. Edmund cast you aside, claiming you were somehow inadequate. But then I, with infinitely more options and infinitely higher standards, choose you. Immediately. Decisively. What does that say about their original assessment? That you're mad? That they were wrong. Cassian leaned forward, his grey eyes intent on hers. My interest validates you, Miss Kingsley. It forces society to reconsider Edmund's rejection. If the Duke of Greystone wants to marry you, clearly you possess qualities they failed to recognize. Suddenly the narrative shifts. You weren't cast aside because you were inadequate. You were released from an unworthy man so that you could accept a proposal from a worthy one. That's manipulative. That's strategic. There's a difference. Cassian smiled slightly. You asked for honesty. Here it is. I need a wife. Society expects it. My family demands it, and frankly, I've grown tired of fending off ambitious mothers and their calculating daughters. I need someone intelligent enough to manage a duchy, strong enough to withstand public scrutiny, and independent enough not to harbor romantic illusions about our arrangement. You need rehabilitation of your reputation and freedom from a constrained future. We can provide each other with exactly what we need. Isadora shook her head slowly. You don't know me, Your Grace. For all you know, I'm exactly as inadequate as Edmund suggested. I know more than you think. I know you're educated well beyond what's typical for young women. I know you speak French, Italian, and passable German. I know you've read extensively in philosophy, history, and literature. I know you volunteer at the charity hospital in Whitechapel, despite your family's modest means. I know you refused 2 previous proposals before accepting Edmund's, both from perfectly respectable men with significantly larger fortunes than his. Her eyes widened. You've been investigating me. Of course I have. Did you imagine I'd propose marriage without understanding exactly who I was proposing to? Cassian's tone remained matter-of-fact. I don't act impulsively, Miss Kingsley. Every decision I make is informed by thorough research and careful consideration. You should find that reassuring rather than alarming. I find it invasive. Would you prefer I'd proposed knowing nothing about you, based purely on a moment of sympathy at a ball? Cassian shook his head. That would be the romantic approach, certainly. It would also be profoundly stupid. I'm offering you a practical arrangement based on mutual benefit and compatible temperaments. Romance has nothing to do with it. Then why me? Isadora's voice dropped, vulnerability creeping through her anger. If this is purely practical, surely there are dozens of suitable women who haven't just been publicly humiliated. Women whose reputations are intact, whose families are more distinguished, whose dowries are larger. There are, Cassian agreed, and every single one of them would enter this marriage expecting love, or at minimum affection. They would want romance, devotion, the fairy tale they've been promised since childhood. Within a year they'd be miserable because I cannot provide those things. I don't have them to give. He stood, moving to the window overlooking the street. His carriage waited below, the matched blacks stamping restlessly in their traces. Curious neighbors still lingered, pretending to go about their business while clearly monitoring the Duke's extended visit. I'm not a romantic man, Miss Kingsley. I don't believe in love matches or soulmates or any of the pretty lies society tells itself. I believe in compatibility, mutual respect, and clearly defined expectations. I believe in partnerships built on honesty rather than illusion. And I believe that you, of all the women I might choose, would understand and accept that arrangement. Because I'm desperate? Because you're realistic. Cassian turned to face her. You've just experienced firsthand what happens when romantic expectations collide with reality. Edmund promised you love, devotion, a partnership. He delivered humiliation instead. I'm offering you something far more valuable. Truth. I will never lie to you about my feelings or intentions. I will never pretend affection I don't feel or make promises I can't keep. What I will give you is respect, partnership, and the full resources of my title and wealth to support whatever interests and pursuits you choose to follow. Isadora stood abruptly, pacing to the pianoforte and back. Her fingers drummed against her skirts, betraying agitation despite her controlled expression. This is madness. You're asking me to marry you for practical reasons, to enter into a loveless arrangement for mutual convenience. That's not a marriage, Your Grace. That's a business contract. Exactly. Cassian watched her pace, noting the nervous energy, the quick intelligence working through his proposal from every angle. And business contracts, unlike romantic promises, can be negotiated. They have terms, conditions, protections for both parties. Tell me, Miss Kingsley, when Edmund proposed to you, did you negotiate terms? Did you discuss expectations, responsibilities, the practical realities of your future together? We discussed our feelings, our hopes for a life together. Feelings change, hopes evaporate, but terms, properly established and mutually agreed upon, provide stability, regardless of emotional fluctuation. Cassian moved closer, though he was careful to maintain appropriate distance. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to partner with me in building something more durable than romance, a true alliance of equals, bound by respect and mutual advantage rather than sentiment. You speak as though love were worthless. I speak as though it's unreliable, which it is. Something shifted in Cassian's expression, a shadow passing across those grey eyes. I've seen what happens when people marry for love. I've watched it destroy more lives than it saved. My own parents loved each other passionately when they wed. Within 5 years, that passion had curdled into resentment. By the time I was 10, they could barely stand to be in the same room. My father sought comfort elsewhere. My mother retreated into melancholy. Neither was willing to end the marriage because they'd promised to love each other forever, and somehow they believed that initial feeling obligated them to maintain the pretense indefinitely. He paused, looking away. Love makes fools of intelligent people, Miss Kingsley. It clouds judgment, creates unrealistic expectations, and inevitably leads to disappointment when reality fails to match the fantasy. I would spare us both that particular misery. Isadora had stopped pacing. She stood very still, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You truly believe that? That love is nothing but delusion and disaster? I believe it's unnecessary for a successful marriage. Respect, compatibility, shared goals, these create stable partnerships. Passion fades, romance dulls, but partnership endures if it's built on solid foundation rather than shifting emotions. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Cassian smiled without humor. Perhaps, but it's also honest. And honesty, Miss Kingsley, is far more valuable than pretty lies. She moved back to her chair, sinking into it with visible weariness. The anger had drained from her, leaving something that looked uncomfortably like resignation. "You've clearly thought this through. You've investigated me, developed your argument, anticipated my objections. You've approached this exactly as you would a business acquisition." "I have. And you truly believe this arrangement would benefit me? That marrying a man who speaks of our potential union as though negotiating a contract for livestock would somehow improve my situation?" "I believe it would transform your situation entirely." Cassian returned to the settee, his posture relaxed, but his attention completely focused on her. "Right now, you're facing social exile. No respectable family will receive you. No gentleman will court you. Your father's position protects you from complete destitution, but your future has narrowed to a small, constrained existence on society's margins, unless you do something dramatic to change the narrative. By marrying you, by marrying me, as the Duchess of Greystone, you would have wealth, position, and influence that no scandal could diminish. You would have freedom to pursue your interests without fear of censure. You could travel, study, involve yourself in charitable works or political causes. You could live exactly as you choose, bound only by the basic discretion any duchess must maintain." "In exchange for what? What would you require of me?" "Public partnership. You would appear at my side for social and political functions when necessary. You would manage the household staff and social obligations that come with my position. You would serve as hostess when I entertain. Beyond that, your time and interests are your own." "And children?" Isadora's voice was very quiet. "An heir for your duchy?" Cassian had expected this question. It was the most delicate aspect of his proposal, the point where practical arrangement necessarily intersected with intimate reality. "Eventually, yes, I need an heir. That's unavoidable given my position, but I'm prepared to wait until you're comfortable with that expectation. And I would never demand more than what's necessary to fulfill that obligation." How civilized! The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. "You're offering me a marriage of convenience in every sense of the term. I'm offering you honesty about what that marriage would entail. Most men would lie, would promise affection and devotion, while ultimately treating their wives as property, whose primary function is providing heirs. I'm telling you exactly what I expect and what I'm prepared to give in return. Doesn't that honesty have value?" Isadora laughed, a sharp sound devoid of humor. "Value? Yes, I suppose it does. The value of knowing exactly how empty my marriage bed will be." "Empty? No." Cassian kept his voice level despite the uncomfortable turn this conversation was taking. "Practical, certainly, but there's no reason the physical aspect of marriage can't be satisfactory for both parties, even absent romantic attachment. Mutual pleasure is possible without love, Miss Kingsley. Some would argue it's more reliably achieved when emotions don't complicate the matter." "You're propositioning me now? In my father's drawing room?" "I'm answering your question honestly. You asked what I would require. I'm telling you." Cassian met her eyes steadily. "I would never force you, never demand more than you're willing to give. But neither will I pretend that physical intimacy isn't a component of the marriage I'm proposing. If you find that prospect intolerable, then this arrangement won't work, and we should end this conversation now." "Why?" The question burst from her suddenly. "Why me, truly? You could have any unmarried woman in England. You don't need to marry someone whose reputation is in tatters. You don't need to complicate your life with the scandal that would inevitably follow this proposal. So why are you really here?" Cassian considered lying. It would be simpler, cleaner to maintain the fiction that this was purely practical calculation, but he'd promised honesty, and something about Isadora Kingsley's direct gaze made him reluctant to break that promise. "Because I saw you run from that ballroom," he said quietly. "I saw your face when you realized what Edmund was doing. I saw you try so desperately to maintain your composure, to hold on to your dignity, even as he deliberately shredded it in front of everyone who mattered. And I recognized something in that moment. Recognized someone who understood that society's glittering surface conceals vicious cruelty, that the rules we're meant to follow serve those in power while destroying anyone who can't or won't conform." He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. You're not like the other women I might marry, Miss Kingsley. You see through pretense, you question assumptions. You think for yourself rather than simply accepting what you've been told. And yes, your current circumstances make this arrangement convenient for both of us. But convenience isn't the only reason I'm here. Then what is? Justice. The word came out harder than Cassian intended. Edmund Hartley deserves to lose you. He deserves to watch you rise to heights he could never hope to achieve. He deserves to understand that his cruelty didn't destroy you. It freed you to accept something far better than he could ever offer. Call it revenge if you like, though I prefer to think of it as appropriate consequences. Isadora stared at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. You're using me as a weapon against Edmund Hartley. I'm offering you the opportunity to be that weapon, yes, and in the process, providing you with a future infinitely better than the one you're currently facing. Cassian allowed himself a slight smile in return. Is that manipulation? Absolutely. But it's honest manipulation executed with your full knowledge and consent, which makes it partnership rather than exploitation. You have an interesting way of defining partnership, Your Grace. I have a practical way of defining it. The question is whether you can accept practicality over romance, partnership over passion, strategic alliance over sentimental attachment. Cassian stood, recognizing that he'd pushed as far as he could today. I'm not asking for an immediate answer. This is too important a decision to make hastily. Take time to consider, discuss it with your father if you wish, but know this, Miss Kingsley, I'll hold this offer open for exactly 3 days. After that, I'll withdraw it and seek a bride elsewhere. 3 days. Isadora rose as well, her expression thoughtful. Why the deadline? Because uncertainty serves neither of us. Either this arrangement works for you, or it doesn't. Either you can envision a future as my partner, or you can't. 3 days is sufficient time to reach that decision. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. If you accept, I'll ensure Edmund Hartley understands exactly what he lost and exactly who gained it. I'll make certain society knows this wasn't rescue or pity. I'll position our marriage as inevitable, as though we'd been drawn to each other all along, and his broken engagement simply freed you to accept a superior offer. More manipulation. Effective narrative control. There's a difference. Cassian's smile was sharp enough to cut. I didn't become the most powerful duke in England by allowing others to control the story, Miss Kingsley. If you marry me, you'll benefit from that skill. If you don't, you'll continue facing the story Edmund Hartley has already written for you. He left her then, striding through the hallway where her father and sister waited with barely concealed curiosity. Richard Kingsley followed him to the door, his expression troubled. Your Grace, might I ask? Your daughter will explain, Mr. Kingsley. The decision is entirely hers. Cassian pulled on his gloves with precise movements. But I will tell you this. I've made her an offer that could restore everything Edmund Hartley tried to destroy. Whether she accepts depends on how practical she's willing to be about her future. Outside, the grey afternoon had darkened toward evening. Cassian's carriage rolled through London's streets, bearing him back to Greystone House, while his mind remained fixed on the scene he'd just left. Isadora's face when he'd proposed, shock giving way to anger, giving way to thoughtful consideration. Her questions, each one intelligent and probing. Her refusal to simply accept his proposal at face value. Her insistence on understanding the reality beneath his carefully constructed offer. She would accept. Cassian felt confident of that, though he acknowledged the possibility of miscalculation. Everything he'd learned about Isadora Kingsley suggested she was practical beneath her romantic dreams, realistic despite her youth. She'd already experienced the cost of trusting romantic promises. She knew her current situation offered no better alternatives than the one he'd presented. She would accept, and when she did, Cassian would ensure that every person who'd watched her flee that ballroom in tears understood they'd misjudged both her value and his intentions. He would remake the narrative so completely that Edmund Hartley's triumph would transform into catastrophic error. It was, Cassian reflected, going to be immensely satisfying. The evening of the third day, Cassian sat in his study reviewing correspondence when his butler announced an unexpected visitor. Richard Kingsley stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Kingsley, I wasn't expecting you." Cassian gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Though I confess I'm not surprised by your visit. You've come on your daughter's behalf. I've come to understand your intentions, Your Grace." Richard settled into the offered chair with the measured movements of a man accustomed to court proceedings. "Isadora has told me about your proposal. She's told me everything you said, every condition you outlined, every promise you made. And I find myself deeply troubled by the entire arrangement." Richard leaned forward, his barrister's instincts evident in his direct approach. "You're proposing a marriage devoid of affection, based purely on mutual advantage. You speak of my daughter as though she were a business asset to be acquired and deployed strategically. You've offered her material comfort in exchange for her compliance with your social and dynastic requirements. Tell me, Your Grace, how is what you're offering any different from what Edmund Hartley promised?" Cassian had expected this challenge. He set down his pen and gave Richard his full attention. "The difference, Mr. Kingsley, is honesty. Edmund promised your daughter love while planning to use her for financial gain. I'm promising her partnership while being entirely transparent about what that partnership entails. One is deception, the other is candor. Candor about treating her as a convenience. Candor about the reality of aristocratic marriage. How many love matches do you see among the ton, Mr. Kingsley? How many couples genuinely care for each other beyond the obligations of their arrangement?" Cassian's voice remained level. "Most marriages in our world are exactly what I'm proposing, strategic alliances dressed up in romantic language to make them palatable. I'm simply declining to use that language. I respect your daughter enough to tell her the truth that you'll never love her, the truth that I won't lie to her about my capacity for that emotion." Cassian rose, moving to the window that overlooked his gardens. "I care deeply about justice, Mr. Kingsley. I care about fairness, about using my power to correct wrongs when I can. I care about competence, intelligence, integrity. What I don't care about, what I've never cared about, is the kind of romantic sentiment that clouds judgment and creates unrealistic expectations." He turned back to face Richard. "Your daughter has just learned the cost of believing romantic promises. She trusted a man who claimed to love her, who performed all the appropriate gestures of devotion, who presented himself as her devoted suitor. Where did that trust lead? To humiliation? To a shattered reputation? To a constrained future? And you're concerned that I'm being too honest about my limitations. I'm concerned that you're offering her a cage, Your Grace, a gilded one, certainly, with all the material comfort she could want, but still a cage, where she'll live without warmth or genuine companionship, bound to a man who sees her as a useful asset rather than a person worth cherishing. Then you misunderstand both my proposal and your daughter's capabilities." Cassian returned to his desk, settling back into his chair with casual authority. "I'm not offering her a cage. I'm offering her a platform. As Duchess of Greystone, she'll have power, resources, and freedom that few women ever achieve. She can pursue any interest that captures her attention. She can support causes she believes in. She can educate herself in any subject she chooses. She can travel, write, involve herself in political discourse if she wishes. The only constraint is basic discretion, which would apply to any duchess regardless of how she married. And you? What constraints will you accept? The same ones I'm asking of her. Public partnership, mutual respect, basic fidelity. I won't embarrass her with obvious affairs or questionable associations. I won't undermine her position or authority. I won't demand more than what we've agreed upon." Cassian met Richard's challenging stare without flinching. "I may not love your daughter, Mr. Kingsley, but I will honor her. That's a promise Edmund Hartley never made and couldn't have kept if he had." Richard was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "Isadora is inclined to accept your proposal. I know. She sees the practical benefits, understands the strategic advantages. She's realistic about her limited options given her current situation." Richard's voice roughened slightly. "She's also 23 years old and deserves better than settling for a loveless arrangement, because scandal has narrowed her choices. What she deserves," Cassian said quietly, "is to make her own decision about her future. Not what her father thinks is best, not what society dictates is appropriate, Not even what romantic ideology suggests she should want. She deserves agency, Mr. Kingsley, the right to choose her path even if others disapprove of that choice. You're asking me to approve something that troubles me deeply. I'm asking you to trust your daughter's judgment. She's intelligent, educated, and perfectly capable of evaluating this proposal on its merits. Cassian leaned back, his expression softening slightly. I understand your concerns. If I had a daughter, I'd want her to marry for love. I'd want her to find someone who cherished her, who made her laugh, who looked at her as though she hung the moon. But that's not what I'm offering, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to everyone involved. Then what are you offering, truly? Security, partnership, respect, the resources to live exactly as she chooses within the basic constraints of her position, and yes, strategic advantage over the man who tried to destroy her. Cassian's eyes hardened. Edmund Hartley humiliated your daughter in the most public way possible. He wanted her crushed, diminished, made into a cautionary tale about women who fail to hold their men's interest. I'm offering her the opportunity to prove him catastrophically wrong. Is that revenge? Perhaps. But it's also justice. Richard stood slowly, his decision clearly made, though reluctance shadowed his features. I want your word, Your Grace. Your word that you'll treat her with kindness, even if you can't offer her affection. Your word that you'll protect her, support her, give her the respect you've promised. Your word that this arrangement won't diminish her, but elevate her. You have it. Cassian rose as well, extending his hand. I may not be the husband you'd have chosen for your daughter, Mr. Kingsley, but I will be a husband who keeps his promises. That's more than many can say, regardless of how they married. They shook hands, a formal gesture that felt like sealing a contract rather than blessing a union. Richard left shortly after, and Cassian returned to his desk, though he found concentration impossible. Somewhere across London, Isadora was making her decision, weighing his offer against her alternatives, calculating costs against benefits with the same practical intelligence that had first drawn his attention. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she felt trapped by circumstances or empowered by choice, whether she resented him for offering so little or respected him for his honesty, whether she'd spend their marriage mourning what might have been or building what could still be. The answer arrived the following morning in the form of a letter delivered by the Kingsley's footman. Cassian's butler presented it on a silver tray, his expression professionally blank, though his eyes betrayed curiosity. The envelope was plain, the handwriting feminine but firm. Cassian broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. Isadora's message was characteristically concise. Your Grace, I accept your proposal under the terms discussed. I do so with clear understanding of what you're offering and what you're not. I'm choosing this path because it serves my interests, not because I lack other options, though society would certainly dispute that claim. You've promised honesty. I'll hold you to that promise, just as I expect you to hold me to mine. I have questions about practical arrangements. When would you like to discuss them? Isadora Kingsley. Cassian read the letter 3 times, analyzing every word choice, every subtle implication. No sentimentality, no romantic language, no pretense of emotions neither of them felt. Just practical acceptance and immediate focus on logistics. It was perfect. She was perfect for exactly the reasons he'd anticipated. He penned a response immediately, his own tone matching hers in business-like directness. They would meet the following afternoon to discuss details, the timeline for their engagement and wedding, the settlements and legal arrangements, the practical management of their future household. Everything would be negotiated clearly, established firmly, agreed upon mutually. Edmund Hartley, Cassian reflected with deep satisfaction, had made the catastrophic error of underestimating Isadora Kingsley. He'd seen an educated, intelligent young woman and interpreted those qualities as flaws that made her unsuitable as his Viscountess. He'd wanted someone more malleable, more decorative, more willing to simply accept whatever treatment he chose to provide. He'd chosen Lady Pembroke, and in doing so he'd freed Isadora to become a duchess. The irony was delicious, the justice was perfect, and Cassian intended to ensure that Edmund understood exactly what he'd lost and exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. 3 weeks later, The engagement announcement appeared in every major newspaper in London. The Duke of Greystone, it declared, was pleased to announce his forthcoming marriage to Miss Isadora Kingsley, daughter of the respected barrister Richard Kingsley. The wedding would take place in 6 weeks at St. George's, Hanover Square, with a reception to follow at Greystone House. The town erupted in speculation. How had this happened? When had the Duke even met Miss Kingsley? Wasn't she the same woman who'd just been publicly rejected by Viscount Hartley? What could possibly explain the Duke's sudden interest in someone so recently scandalous? Cassian controlled the narrative with masterful precision. Through carefully placed comments at his club, strategic conversations with influential society matrons, and subtle implications dropped during political discussions, he shaped the story exactly as he'd promised Isadora he would. They'd met months ago, the story went, at a small gathering where her intelligence and conversation had immediately captured his attention. He'd been intrigued, but hadn't acted because she was engaged to Hartley. When that engagement ended, well, he'd seen his opportunity and seized it without hesitation. Edmund Hartley's rejection in this narrative wasn't humiliation, but liberation. The Viscount had done Miss Kingsley an enormous favour by freeing her to accept a far superior offer. Really, people whispered, one had to wonder about Hartley's judgment. Did he truly not recognise what he had? Did he honestly believe Lady Pembroke's wealth compensated for missing the opportunity to have the Duke of Greystone's future wife as his own? Edmund, predictably, did not take the news well. Cassian heard reports of the Viscount's angry outbursts, his insistence that there was something suspicious about the Duke's sudden proposal, his attempts to spread counter-narratives about Isadora's character and suitability. But Edmund had already used his credibility destroying Isadora's reputation. No one was inclined to believe his current claims, particularly when contradicting them meant contradicting the Duke of Greystone. The Duke, after all, was known for his judgment, his strategic thinking, his refusal to act without careful consideration. If he'd chosen Miss Kingsley, clearly there was more to her than society had initially recognized. Perhaps they'd all been too quick to accept Hartley's version of events. Perhaps Miss Kingsley had been the wronged party all along, and the Duke's proposal was simply righting an injustice. Cassian watched this narrative shift with professional satisfaction. This was what power meant, not just having resources and authority, but knowing how to deploy them to reshape reality itself. He was rewriting Isadora's story in real time, transforming her from victim to victor, from scandal to success. And he was doing it so smoothly that most people didn't even realize they were being manipulated, all according to plan. The 6 weeks between announcement and wedding passed in a calculated blur of social appearances and strategic positioning. Cassian orchestrated each event with the precision of a military campaign, ensuring maximum visibility and optimal messaging. Isadora, to her credit, played her part with natural grace that required minimal coaching. Their first public appearance together was at the opera, 3 days after the engagement announcement. Cassian arrived at Portland Place in his formal carriage, the ducal crest blazing on the door panels in gold leaf that caught the evening light. Neighbours gathered to watch, no longer whispering scandal but rather speculation about the upcoming wedding. Isadora emerged from her house wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that Cassian had commissioned specifically for the occasion. It was cut in the latest fashion, elegant without being ostentatious, and the colour brought out the gold in her amber eyes. He'd sent his mother's emeralds as well, a necklace, earrings and bracelet that proclaimed his intentions more clearly than words ever could. A gentleman didn't loan family jewels to anyone less than his intended wife. She paused when she saw the gems, her fingers hovering over the necklace before looking up to meet his eyes. "These are extraordinary. They're yours now." Cassian helped her fasten the clasp, his fingers briefly brushing the nape of her neck. "My mother wore them on her wedding day. It's appropriate that you should have them." "Your mother?" Isadora's voice trailed off uncertainly. "Is deceased. 5 years now." Cassian stepped back, examining the overall effect with satisfaction. The emeralds glowed against her skin, the silk draped perfectly. Her hair was styled in an elegant chignon that emphasized her features rather than overwhelming them. "She would have approved of you, I think. She valued intelligence over empty charm." even in a loveless arrangement? Especially in one. She understood better than most what happens when people marry for passion and discover too late that feeling isn't foundation enough. Cassian offered his arm. "Shall we? The curtain rises at 8 and I'd prefer to arrive when the lobby is fullest. Maximum visibility serves our purposes tonight." The Opera House lobby was indeed crowded when they arrived, and Cassian felt the collective attention shift toward them, like iron filings responding to a magnet. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Fans snapped open to provide cover for urgent whispers. Every eye tracked their progress as Cassian guided Isadora through the throng with his hand, resting possessively at her waist. He made certain to stop and acknowledge key figures, the Duchess of Pemberton, whose approval could make or break social acceptance, Lord Ashworth, still uncomfortable about the scene at his ball, but too politically astute to openly question the Duke's choices, Lady Caroline Fairfax, the ton's most influential gossip, whose interpretation of events would be repeated in every drawing-room by week's end. "Your Grace," Lady Caroline materialized before them in a rustle of purple taffeta, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Isadora's appearance. "How delightful to see you. And Miss Kingsley, may I say how radiant you look this evening? That necklace is absolutely stunning." "Thank you, Lady Caroline." Isadora's voice was steady, betraying none of the nervousness Cassian could feel in the slight tension of her body against his. "The Duke has been most generous. The Greystone emeralds, unless I'm mistaken." Lady Caroline's gaze sharpened with interest. "My dear, those are family heirlooms, quite significant family heirlooms. You should feel honored." "I do." Isadora managed a small smile. "Though I confess, I'm still adjusting to such grand gestures. You'll have to become accustomed to them soon enough." Lady Caroline turned her attention to Cassian. "I must tell you, Your Grace, your engagement has quite taken society by surprise. Though upon reflection, I find myself recalling that small dinner party at the Havish AMS's last spring. You and Miss Kingsley had quite an animated discussion about Shelley's poetry, didn't you? At the time, I thought you seemed unusually engaged in the conversation." Cassian smiled slightly, recognizing the fabrication for what it was, Lady Caroline creating retroactive evidence to support the narrative he'd been crafting. He'd never attended a dinner party at the Havishams, and he doubted Isadora had either. But if Lady Caroline wanted to remember such an event, who was he to contradict her? "Miss Kingsley's insights were remarkable," he agreed smoothly. "I found myself thinking about that conversation for weeks afterward." "How romantic!" Lady Caroline beamed, clearly pleased with herself for identifying this supposedly crucial moment. "And to think, all that time you were both promised to others. It must have been quite torturous, suppressing such a connection." "The heart wants what it wants," Cassian said, managing to sound both resigned and satisfied simultaneously. "Propriety demanded I respect Miss Kingsley's prior commitment. When that commitment ended, well, I saw no reason to delay making my intentions clear." 2 days, Lady Caroline laughed delightedly. "Yes, I heard about that. The Duke of Greystone appearing at the Kingsley residence 2 days after the broken engagement. Society didn't know what to make of it at first, but now it all makes sense. You were claiming what should have been yours all along." "Something like that." Cassian inclined his head politely. "If you'll excuse us, Lady Caroline, I believe the warning bell has sounded. We should take our seats." He guided Isadora away, feeling her release a long breath as they escaped Lady Caroline's scrutiny. "She's inventing that dinner party," Isadora whispered. "I've never been to the Havishams." "I know, but let her invent. Each fabricated memory, each retroactive understanding of our relationship strengthens the narrative. By the time we actually marry, half of society will swear they saw our attachment developing for months." Cassian led her up the stairs toward the ducal box. "That's how you control a story, Miss Kingsley. You don't fight against invention. You allow it, encourage it even, as long as it serves your purposes." The ducal box overlooked the stage from the best vantage point in the house, as befitted Cassian's rank. But position meant more than simply having an optimal view. It meant being visible to everyone below, their box lit and displayed like a tableau for the assembled company's inspection. Cassian seated Isadora prominently at the box's front, taking his place beside her so that every face turned upward could see them clearly. He leaned close as if sharing an intimate observation, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. To observers, it would appear as lovers absorbed in each other's company. In reality, he was explaining the political dynamics currently playing out several boxes over, where a cabinet minister was conspicuously ignoring his wife while entertaining his mistress. "You see how she pretends not to notice?" Cassian gestured subtly. "That's Lady Whitmore's particular talent, the art of strategic blindness. She maintains her dignity by refusing to acknowledge what everyone knows to be true." "That sounds exhausting." "It is, which is why I prefer transparency, even when the truth is uncomfortable." He glanced down at her, noting the way the stage lights played across her features. "We may not have a conventional arrangement, Miss Kingsley, but at least we won't be performing for each other. We save our performances for them." She followed his gesture, taking in the hundreds of faces turned their direction. "They're all watching us." "Of course they are. We're the evening's main entertainment, more compelling than anything happening on stage." Cassian settled back in his chair, deliberately relaxed. Let them watch. Let them speculate. Let them invent whatever romantic narrative helps them reconcile the Duke of Greystone's unexpected choice. Every moment we spend here, visible and apparently content, strengthens your position. The opera was La Traviata, Verdi's tale of doomed love and social redemption. Cassian found the parallel almost too perfect, a woman of questionable reputation finding unexpected love with a man of higher status, only to be destroyed by society's unforgiving judgment. The primary difference, of course, was that Cassian had no intention of allowing society to destroy Isadora. Quite the opposite. During the first intermission, their box filled with visitors paying respects and fishing for information. Cassian received them all with practiced courtesy, deflecting invasive questions while allowing just enough information to feed the speculation. Yes, he and Miss Kingsley had known each other longer than people realized. No, he wouldn't characterize their prior acquaintance as clandestine, merely discreet. Yes, the timing was remarkably fortunate for both of them. No, he had no comment on Viscount Hartley's current situation, though he wished the gentleman well. Isadora handled the attention better than Cassian had anticipated. She answered questions directly without oversharing, smiled at appropriate moments, and maintained precisely the right balance between gratified bride-to-be and composed young woman who understood her great fortune. Only Cassian, attuned to subtle tells, noticed the way her hands clenched in her lap when Edmund Hartley's name arose, or the slight tightening around her eyes when particularly invasive questions pressed too close to painful truths. Edmund himself appeared during the second intermission, Lady Pembroke clinging to his arm like a barnacle. The Viscount's handsome face was flushed with wine and poorly suppressed anger. He'd clearly been drinking heavily, and his voice carried too loudly as he addressed Cassian with forced bonhomie. "Your Grace, congratulations on your forthcoming nuptials. Quite a surprise to everyone, I must say." "Hartley." Cassian's tone could have frozen water. "How unexpected to see you. I'd thought you'd prefer to avoid situations that might prove awkward." "Awkward? Why would this be awkward?" Edmund's laugh was brittle. "I'm delighted for both of you. Absolutely delighted. It all worked out perfectly, didn't it? I found my true match." He gestured toward Lady Pembroke, who preened, and Miss Kingsley found hers. "Very tidy." "Tidy." Cassian repeated the word thoughtfully. "An interesting characterization, though I confess, Hartley, I don't share your assessment. There was nothing tidy about your conduct at Ashworth's ball, nor about your subsequent treatment of Miss Kingsley." The ducal box had gone very quiet. Other visitors watched with barely concealed fascination, recognizing the promise of confrontation. Edmund's face darkened further. "I ended an engagement that wasn't working. That's my prerogative." "Indeed it is, as it's my prerogative to observe that you demonstrated remarkably poor judgment in letting Miss Kingsley go." Cassian stood, using his superior height to emphasize the power differential. "But then, poor judgment seems to be a pattern with you, doesn't it? Your brother's untimely death, your financial difficulties, your choice of companions." His gaze flickered dismissively over Lady Pembroke. "One begins to wonder about your capacity for sound decision-making." "You go too far, Your Grace." "Do I? Strange, I was thinking the same about you." Cassian's voice dropped to a register that didn't carry beyond their immediate group, but conveyed unmistakable threat. "You come to my box. You address my fiancée with familiar ease despite your recent treatment of her. You pretend friendship when we both know your true feelings. And you do all this while drunk enough that your manners have entirely deserted you. Tell me, Hartley, exactly how far would you like me to go in pointing out the deficiencies in your character and judgment?" Edmund swayed slightly, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, Cassian thought the man might actually be foolish enough to throw a punch. That would be entertaining, if professionally problematic. But Lady Pembroke tugged urgently at Edmund's arm, whispering something that made him reconsider whatever rash action he'd been contemplating. "Enjoy your triumph, Your Grace," Edmund finally managed, his voice thick with barely suppressed rage. "I hope you find happiness with damaged goods." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Cassian felt Isadora flinch beside him, saw color flood then drain from her face. The watching guests inhaled collectively, recognizing that Edmund had just crossed a line that even alcohol didn't excuse. Cassian moved with deliberate calm, crossing the distance to Edmund in 2 measured steps. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, meant for Edmund's ears alone, though the surrounding silence ensured others caught fragments. "You will retract that statement immediately and apologize to Miss Kingsley. Then you will leave this box and avoid any future situation where you might encounter her." "Those are not suggestions, Hartley. They're conditions of your continued presence in polite society." "You can't—" "I can do whatever I choose. I'm the Duke of Greystone. My word carries more weight than your entire family's accumulated credibility." Cassian's eyes had gone cold, all pretense of civility abandoned. "More specifically, I can ensure that every gentleman's club in London bars you from membership. I can see that your creditors lose patience with your payment schedules. I can make certain that every whisper about your brother's convenient death resurfaces with renewed vigor. I can systematically dismantle what little remains of your reputation and standing until you're persona non grata everywhere that matters." "Is that clear enough, or shall I elaborate?" Edmund had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's coolness. He looked like a man who just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "You're threatening me." "I'm educating you about consequences. There's a difference." Cassian stepped back, his voice returning to normal conversational volume. "Now, I believe you have an apology to make." The silence stretched painfully. Every eye in the box watched Edmund struggle with his pride, his anger, and his belated understanding that he'd made a catastrophic tactical error. Finally, he turned to Isadora, his jaw so tight, Cassian wondered if he might crack teeth. "My apologies, Miss Kingsley. I spoke in haste and without proper consideration." "Apology accepted, Lord Hartley." Isadora's voice was steady, though Cassian heard the tremor beneath her composure. "I hope you and Lady Pembroke will be very happy together." The dismissal was elegant and absolute. Edmund had no choice but to leave, Lady Pembroke hurrying after him while shooting anxious glances back at Cassian. The moment they departed, conversation erupted like a breaking dam. Everyone spoke at once, exclaiming over Edmund's rudeness, praising Cassian's defense of his fiancée, marveling at the Viscount's apparent self-destruction. Cassian waited until the final act concluded and their box cleared before addressing Isadora directly. She'd maintained perfect composure throughout the remaining performance, but he could see the cost in the set of her shoulders, the deliberate care with which she moved. "I apologize for that scene," he said quietly as they prepared to depart. "I should have anticipated Hartley might appear. I should have prevented the confrontation." "How? By banning him from the opera house?" Isadora managed a wan smile. "He was always going to say something eventually. Better to have it happen under controlled circumstances, where you could respond immediately." "Is that what you think tonight was? Controlled? Wasn't it?" She looked up at him, those amber eyes too perceptive. "You handled him exactly as you intended. You established that insulting me means making an enemy of the Duke of Greystone. You demonstrated to everyone watching that you'll protect your interests, which currently include me. And you did it all while maintaining plausible deniability about your actual motivations. Cassian found himself genuinely impressed. You understand tactical social maneuvering better than I realized. I'm a quick study, and I pay attention. Isadora accepted his hand as he helped her into the carriage. That's what you need in a duchess, isn't it? Someone who understands the game and plays it competently. Among other qualities, yes. Cassian settled into the seat opposite her, studying her face in the carriage's dim interior. Are you all right? That insult was crude and deliberate. I wouldn't blame you for being upset. I'm furious, she admitted, but I'm also aware that showing fury would undermine everything we're trying to accomplish. So I'll maintain composure in public and be furious in private. That seems to be the pattern of my new life. One of many patterns you'll need to master. Cassian leaned back, the carriage swaying gently as it rolled through London's streets. This is the reality of being a duchess, Miss Kingsley. You'll face insults, challenges to your position, people who want to see you fail. The question is whether you can handle that pressure without breaking. And if I can't, then our arrangement won't work, and we'll both have made a costly error. He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment, but I don't believe that will happen. You're stronger than you realize. Tonight proved it. They rode in silence for several minutes before Isadora spoke again, her voice thoughtful. You defended me tonight, not because you care about me personally, but because I'm your property now, and protecting me protects your interests. If that interpretation makes the arrangement more palatable, certainly. Cassian studied her expression. Does it bother you, being defended for strategic rather than emotional reasons? I haven't decided yet. Isadora's fingers traced patterns on the emerald bracelet. Edmund claimed to love me, and that love dissolved the moment someone better came along. You claim nothing beyond practical interest, yet you've shown me more genuine protection than he ever did. There's irony in that. There's honesty in it. Emotion is unreliable. Self-interest, properly aligned, creates far more stable foundations for trust. Cassian gestured toward the jewels she wore. Those emeralds, my mother's most prized possession. I gave them to you not because of tender feelings, but because adorning you with Greystone family heirlooms sends a specific message. Yet the result is the same. You're wearing jewels worth a small fortune, jewels that now belong to you, regardless of my motivations. Everything is transaction with you. Everything is transaction with everyone. I simply acknowledge it openly. The carriage slowed as they approached Portland Place. Most people prefer comfortable lies, Miss Kingsley. I prefer uncomfortable truth, the choice of which you'd rather live with is entirely yours. He escorted her to her door, executed a proper farewell that would satisfy any watching neighbors, and returned to his carriage thinking about her parting look. Not gratitude exactly, not affection certainly, something more complex. Respect perhaps mixed with reservation. She was still evaluating him, still deciding whether this arrangement was sustainable or merely postponing inevitable disaster. Good. He preferred women who thought critically, rather than simply accepting whatever they were told. The wedding preparations consumed the following weeks with exhausting efficiency. Cassian delegated most details to his household staff and Isadora herself, intervening only when strategic decisions required his input. The guest list became a political document, carefully balanced between family obligations, social necessities, and strategic alliances. The venue, St. George's, Hanover Square, was chosen specifically because its prominence would make their union impossible to ignore or diminish. Even the flowers were selected for symbolic impact, white roses for new beginnings, intertwined with deep red peonies for honor and respectability. Cassian met with Isadora weekly to review progress and address concerns. These meetings took place in his study at Greystone House, formal affairs where they sat across his massive desk like negotiating parties rather than engaged couples. He found the arrangement oddly comfortable, and there was no need for romantic pretense, no pressure to perform affection. They discussed logistics, solved problems, and made decisions with the brisk efficiency of business partners. During their fourth such meeting, Isadora surprised him by asking about the marriage settlements. I assumed my father would handle those negotiations, she said, reviewing the seating chart for the wedding breakfast. "But he mentioned you'd prefer to discuss terms directly with me. Your father is welcome to review everything, certainly. But you're the one entering this arrangement, Miss Kingsley. You should understand exactly what you're agreeing to." Cassian pulled a folder from his desk drawer. "I've had my solicitor draft standard settlements, but I want your input before finalizing anything." He spread the documents before her, watching as she read through them with careful attention. Her eyebrows rose as she absorbed the details. "This is extraordinarily generous." "Is it? I disagree." Cassian pointed to specific clauses. "You'll have an annual allowance of £5,000 for personal expenses, separate from household accounts. The Grosvenor Square townhouse will be yours to manage as you see fit. You'll have access to the estate's income for charitable donations up to £2,000 annually without requiring my approval. Upon my death, you'll receive a widow's portion of £10,000 per year, plus use of the dower house at Greystone Manor. And if our marriage produces children, each will receive trust funds established at birth. Most settlements don't provide widows with nearly so much independence. Most settlements treat wives as dependents who need to be managed. I'm treating you as a partner who deserves appropriate resources." Cassian leaned back, watching her process this information. "There are conditions, of course. Fidelity is non-negotiable. I won't have my children's legitimacy questioned. You'll fulfill the basic social obligations that come with your position, and you'll maintain appropriate discretion about our private arrangements." "Appropriate discretion," Isadora repeated slowly, "meaning I shouldn't tell people our marriage is essentially a business contract, meaning you understand the distinction between public performance and private reality. What we do behind closed doors is our affair. What we present to the world is a conventional ducal marriage." Cassian studied her face. "Does that distinction trouble you?" "It's practical. I'm learning to appreciate practicality." She returned her attention to the documents. "What about my own pursuits? You've mentioned freedom to follow my interests, but these settlements don't specify what that means. Because I can't anticipate what those interests might be. If you want to establish a charitable foundation, pursue scholarly research, write, paint, involve yourself in political causes, whatever captures your attention, you'll have the resources and freedom to pursue it." Cassian pulled out a separate document. "I've included a clause granting you independent decision-making authority over your allowance and charitable funds. You don't need my permission to spend that money as you choose." Isadora's fingers traced the clause he indicated. Most husbands would never agree to such terms. They'd want control over every expenditure. Most husbands don't trust their wives' judgment. I see no reason to micromanage how you spend money that's rightfully yours." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I meant what I said about partnership, Miss Kingsley. I'm not interested in a wife who simply decorates my household and produces heirs. I want someone capable of managing complex responsibilities, making sound decisions, and representing Greystone interests when I can't be present. That requires giving you actual authority, not just ceremonial position. And if I make decisions you disagree with, then we'll discuss them like reasonable adults. I'm not a tyrant despite what some might suggest." A slight smile crossed his features. "Though I reserve the right to be difficult if your choices seem particularly unwise." How magnanimous! But she was smiling too, just slightly. "These terms are acceptable, more than acceptable. I'll have my father review them, but I don't anticipate any objections." "Good." Cassian gathered the documents, preparing to send them to his solicitor. "Was there anything else you wanted to discuss?" Isadora hesitated, and he saw something shift in her expression. Uncertainty, perhaps, or embarrassment. "Actually, yes. There's something we haven't addressed directly, though it's implied in several conversations. The physical aspect of our marriage." Cassian said it plainly, without euphemism. "I wondered when you'd bring it up." Color rose in her cheeks, but she met his eyes steadily. "You mentioned needing an heir that requires certain activities, but you've also been clear that this isn't a love match, so I'm trying to understand what you actually expect. Honesty, remember." Cassian kept his tone neutral, professional, as if discussing household management rather than intimacy. "I expect that we'll share a bed occasionally, yes, not out of passionate desire, but because producing an heir requires it. I'll need at least one son, preferably two to ensure succession. Beyond that, the frequency and nature of our physical relationship is negotiable. Negotiable. She said the word carefully. You make it sound like a business arrangement. Isn't it? We're not pretending this is a romantic union. Why pretend the physical component is anything other than practical? Cassian stood, moving to the window so this conversation felt less like an interrogation. I won't force myself on you, Miss Kingsley. I won't demand more than you're comfortable giving, but neither will I pretend we can avoid intimacy entirely while still fulfilling the basic requirements of aristocratic marriage. And between those requirements, once there's an heir, then we negotiate new terms based on mutual preference. If you want separate bedrooms and minimal contact, I'll respect that. If you prefer a more active arrangement, I'm amenable to that as well. He glanced back at her. The point is flexibility, not rigid expectations that don't account for how we actually feel once we're married. Isadora absorbed this silently. Cassian gave her time, understanding that discussing such intimate matters with essential strangers was inherently awkward. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. I appreciate your directness. It's better than wondering or making assumptions. She paused, though I confess this all feels remarkably clinical. Would you prefer I woo you with poetic declarations about burning desire? Pretend I'm overcome with passion I don't feel? Cassian turned to face her fully. I can certainly perform that role if it makes the reality more palatable, but I thought we'd agreed on honesty. We did. And you're right. False passion would be worse than clinical practicality. Isadora stood as well, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. I suppose I'm still adjusting to a marriage that treats intimacy as functional rather than sacred. Sacred is a lovely fiction for people who can afford it. We're entering a strategic alliance, Miss Kingsley. That doesn't mean it has to be cold or unpleasant. It simply means we're clear-eyed about its nature. Cassian moved closer, though he was careful to maintain appropriate distance. I will never lie to you about my feelings. I will never perform affection I don't have. But I will treat you with respect, ensure your comfort, and make every effort to see that our physical relationship is mutually satisfactory when it occurs. Can you accept that? I'm trying to. She met his eyes, and he saw complex emotions warring in her expression. Resignation, uncertainty, and something that might have been relief. It's just very different from what I imagined marriage would be. What you imagined before Edmund Hartley shattered those illusions, you mean? Cassian kept his voice gentle, despite the blunt words. I'm sorry your romantic dreams ended badly, but I'm offering you something more durable than dreams. A partnership built on reality rather than fantasy. The question is whether you can find value in that, even if it's not what you originally wanted. Ask me again after we're married, Isadora said softly. Right now, I'm still too close to the disappointment to see clearly. They concluded their meeting shortly thereafter, and Cassian found himself thinking about her words as his carriage returned him to Parliament for afternoon sessions. She was still mourning her lost romantic ideals, still adjusting to a future that looked nothing like what she'd envisioned. That was understandable, even expected. The question was whether she'd eventually accept their arrangement's limitations or spend their marriage resenting him for what he couldn't provide. Time would tell. And in the meantime, they had a wedding to execute and a narrative to cement. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of strategic theatre. St. George's was packed with everyone who mattered in London society, plus enough minor aristocracy and influential merchants to send a message about Greystone's broad power base. Cassian had ensured maximum visibility. This wedding would be discussed, analysed, and remembered for years as the event that transformed Isadora Kingsley from scandalous cast-off to Duchess of Greystone. He waited at the altar in formal attire, his posture relaxed despite the hundreds of eyes fixed on him. This was merely another performance, another carefully orchestrated moment in his ongoing campaign to control his own narrative. The organ swelled as Isadora appeared at the far end of the aisle, and Cassian allowed himself to appreciate the visual impact. She wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace overlay, the design elegant without being ostentatious. His mother's emeralds glowed at her throat and wrists, proclaiming her status as Greystone's chosen bride. Her father walked beside her, pride and concern warring on his weathered face. But it was Isadora herself who commanded attention, her bearing regal, her expression serene, every inch the duchess she was about to become. Their eyes met as she approached the altar, and Cassian saw steel beneath her composure. She'd armored herself for this moment, prepared to face down every whisper and speculation with dignity that refused to acknowledge any impropriety. Good. She'd need that strength for what lay ahead. The ceremony proceeded with traditional formality. Cassian spoke his vows clearly, precisely, meaning every word, even as he acknowledged their practical rather than romantic nature. Isadora's voice remained steady throughout, though he noticed her hands trembling slightly when he slipped the wedding band onto her finger, heavy gold engraved with the Greystone crest, impossible to overlook or misinterpret. When the Archbishop pronounced them married and Cassian kissed his new wife, he kept it brief and respectful. This was public performance, not private passion. Isadora's lips were soft against his, her breath catching slightly at the contact, but she didn't pull away or falter. She understood her role in this production as well as he understood his. The reception at Greystone House was equally orchestrated. Cassian had opened the ballroom and staterooms for the first time since his mother's death, creating a display of wealth and power that reminded everyone exactly what Isadora had gained through this marriage. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Champagne flowed from fountains. An orchestra played from a specially constructed gallery. Footmen in ducal livery moved through the crowds with practiced efficiency. And through it all, Cassian kept Isadora at his side, his hand at her waist or holding hers, presenting them as a united front. He introduced her to political allies, powerful merchants, influential society matrons, everyone whose approval or influence might prove useful. He watched with satisfaction as she charmed them all, her intelligence and genuine interest in their concerns winning over even the most skeptical. Edmund Hartley had not been invited, of course, but Lady Pembroke attended, looking increasingly uncomfortable as she watched Isadora move through the glittering reception with the ease of someone born to such environments. The contrast was stark. Lady Pembroke, for all her wealth, lacked the natural grace and intelligence that made Isadora shine in this setting. Edmund had traded substance for flash, and was doubtless regretting that choice. Late in the evening, after the formal toasts and ceremonial cake-cutting, Cassian finally had a moment alone with his new wife. They stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the sounds of celebration muted behind closed doors. "Exhausted?" he asked, noting the weariness she no longer bothered to hide. "Thoroughly. Is every social obligation this draining?" "Most of them, yes. You'll adapt." Cassian leaned against the balustrade, studying her profile in the moonlight. "You did well today. Better than I anticipated, actually. Several people specifically commented on your poise and charm. How gratifying to meet expectations." But there was no heat in her sarcasm, just tired resignation. "What happens now? Do we return to the reception and perform for a few more hours?" "No. We've been present long enough. It's acceptable for newlyweds to retire early." He kept his voice carefully neutral. "The staff have prepared the ducal suite. Separate bedrooms with a connecting door, as we discussed. You can retire whenever you wish." Isadora glanced at him, something complicated flickering in her eyes. "And you? Will you be retiring as well, or returning to the reception?" "That depends on your preference. This is our wedding night, after all. Society expects certain activities." Cassian met her gaze directly. "But I meant what I said about not forcing anything. If you'd prefer to simply sleep, I have no objection. There's no urgency about producing an heir immediately." She was silent for a long moment, her fingers twisting the heavy gold ring on her left hand. When she spoke, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. I think I'd prefer not to think of this as a business transaction tonight. Just for tonight, could we pretend this is normal, that we're simply two people who married and are retiring to our rooms together?" "If that helps, certainly." Cassian straightened, offering his arm. Shall we? They left the reception together, ignoring the knowing looks and barely suppressed smiles from guests who imagined they understood what this early departure meant. Cassian led Isadora through Greystone House's corridors to the ducal suite, rooms that had stood empty since his mother's death. The staff had prepared everything beautifully. Candles glowed throughout the sitting room that connected the two bedrooms. Fresh flowers perfumed the air. A fire crackled in the hearth despite the spring warmth. Through the open door to what was now Isadora's bedroom, Cassian could see her trunks already unpacked, her belongings arranged with care. "I'll give you privacy to change," he said, moving toward his own room. "If you need anything, just—" "Wait," Isadora's voice stopped him. I'm not sure I want to be alone right now. This is all very strange, and I'm more nervous than I expected to be," and she trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "Never mind, that was foolish." "It wasn't foolish." Cassian turned back to face her. "This is a significant transition. It's natural to feel uncertain." "You don't seem uncertain. You seem perfectly comfortable with all of this." "I'm very good at appearing comfortable when I'm not. It's a useful skill." He moved to the sideboard where someone had left brandy and glasses. "Would you like a drink? It might help with the nerves." "Yes. Thank you." He poured 2 glasses, handing her one before settling into a chair near the fire. Isadora remained standing, sipping her brandy while studying the room's elegant furnishings. "These were your mother's rooms," she said finally. "Your father's as well, I assume, given the connecting door." "Yes. They maintained separate bedrooms as most aristocratic couples do. The sitting room served as neutral territory when they actually wanted to spend time together." Cassian swirled his brandy absently. "Toward the end, even that became too much proximity. My father moved to a different wing entirely." "That sounds lonely." It was realistic. They'd fallen out of love, if they were ever truly in love to begin with, and saw no reason to maintain pretense of compatibility. He looked up at her. "I tell you this not to depress you, but to illustrate why I prefer our arrangement. At least we're honest about what we are to each other. There's dignity in that honesty." Isadora sat finally, curling into the chair opposite his. The firelight caught the emeralds at her throat, making them glow like captured fire. "I keep trying to decide if you're cynical or simply realistic." "Can't I be both?" Cassian smiled slightly. "I'm cynical about romantic love specifically because I'm realistic about human nature generally. People are changeable, emotions are unstable, and passion inevitably fades. Those aren't cynical observations. They're documented patterns that most people choose to ignore because they're uncomfortable truths. But doesn't that make life rather bleak? If you can't believe in love or connection or genuine partnership beyond strategic advantage. I believe in all those things. I simply don't believe they require romantic love as a prerequisite." Cassian leaned forward, his grey eyes intent. "I respect you, Isadora. I value your intelligence, your strength, your capacity for strategic thinking. I enjoy our conversations and appreciate your company. Those feelings are real, even if they're not romantic. Why isn't that enough foundation for a successful marriage?" She considered this, her amber eyes thoughtful. "Because most people need more than respect and appreciation. They need warmth, affection, the feeling that they matter to someone beyond their functional utility. And you think I can't provide that? Can you?" The question was gentle, genuinely curious rather than challenging. "Can you make me feel like I matter beyond being a useful duchess who manages your household competently?" Cassian stood, crossing to her chair and kneeling so they were at eye level. The position felt awkward, too reminiscent of romantic gestures he'd spent his life avoiding, but sometimes discomfort served a purpose. "You matter because you're intelligent when I'm surrounded by fools. You matter because you see through social pretense as clearly as I do. You matter because you're brave enough to enter an unconventional arrangement rather than accepting conventional misery." He reached out gently, taking her hand. "I may not love you in the romantic sense, Isadora, but I value you far more than I've valued anyone in a very long time. If that's not enough, tell me now, because I won't pretend emotions I don't have just to make this arrangement more palatable." She didn't pull her hand away, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I don't know if it's enough. I'm too confused and overwhelmed right now to know anything clearly. Then we'll take this slowly, one day at a time, one decision at a time, until you do know. Cassian squeezed her hand gently before releasing it and standing. It's late, and you're exhausted. Why don't you get some rest? I'll be in the next room if you need anything. Thank you. Isadora stood as well, touching his arm briefly before heading toward her bedroom. At the threshold, she paused, looking back. Cassian, thank you for being honest, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. Always, he promised, and meant it. The first weeks of marriage established patterns that would define their life together. Cassian rose early for business and political obligations. Isadora managed household affairs with efficiency that impressed even his veteran staff. They breakfasted together when schedules allowed, discussing the day's plans with the casual familiarity of longtime associates. Evenings brought social obligations, dinners, soirees, political gatherings, where they performed their roles as devoted newlyweds with practiced skill. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the performance began to feel less like acting and more like reality. Cassian noticed it first in small moments, the way Isadora's face lit up when he returned home after long days at Parliament, how she'd taken to leaving books she thought he'd enjoy on his desk, with notes explaining what had captured her interest. The casual touches as they moved through their shared spaces, her hand on his arm, his palm at the small of her back, gestures that had started as public performance, but now occurred even when no one watched. 3 weeks into their marriage, Cassian returned home late to find Isadora still awake, reading in the sitting room that connected their bedrooms. She'd changed into a dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, in a way that made her look younger, less guarded. "You should be asleep," he said, loosening his cravat as he entered. "It's past midnight." "I couldn't sleep. Too much thinking." She marked her place in the book, Locke's essay concerning human understanding, he noted with approval, and set it aside. "How was the House of Lords?" "Frustrating. We're debating factory legislation, and most of my colleagues care more about protecting their investments than protecting workers." Cassian poured himself brandy, then hesitated. "Would you like some?" "Please." He poured a second glass, settling into the chair opposite hers with a sigh of exhaustion. Lord Pemberton actually argued that child labour builds character, as if forcing 6-year-olds to work 16-hour days in dangerous conditions is some sort of moral education. "What did you say?" "That he's a fool whose moral compass is broken beyond repair." In more diplomatic language, obviously. Cassian sipped his brandy. "Though I'm increasingly tempted to abandon diplomacy entirely. Sometimes people need to be told directly that their positions are indefensible." Isadora smiled. "I would have enjoyed witnessing that conversation. You'd have been bored. Most parliamentary debate is tedious posturing by men who love the sound of their own voices." He studied her face in the firelight. "What were you thinking about? You said too much thinking kept you awake." She hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. "Us, actually. This arrangement. How strange it is that I'm more comfortable with you now than I ever was with Edmund, despite knowing you far less time and having far less romantic foundation." "Is that strange? Or is it simply that honesty creates better foundation than romantic illusion?" "Possibly both." Isadora leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Edmund told me what he thought I wanted to hear. He performed devotion beautifully, but I never truly knew him, never understood his actual thoughts or motivations. With you, I know exactly where I stand. There's security in that clarity, even when the truth isn't particularly comforting." "Not particularly comforting," Cassian repeated with dry humor, damning with faint praise. "You know what I mean. It's not comforting to know your husband doesn't love you, but it's oddly reassuring to know he'll be honest about his limitations rather than pretending emotions he doesn't feel." She met his eyes. "Though I confess I'm starting to wonder if your limitations are as absolute as you believe." "Meaning?" "Meaning you claim not to feel affection beyond respect and appreciation. But I've watched you these past weeks, Cassian. The way you ensure I'm comfortable at social events. How you defend me when anyone questions my position. The small considerations, books left on my desk ensuring my favorite tea is always stocked, remembering details about my interests and referencing them in conversation. She paused. That's not just respect. That's care. Genuine care, even if you're reluctant to call it affection. Cassian felt unexpectedly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. She wasn't wrong exactly. He had found himself thinking about her comfort and happiness more than strictly necessary for their arrangement. But acknowledging that felt dangerous, like admitting weakness he couldn't afford. I'm attentive to your needs because we're partners, he said carefully. Your satisfaction with our arrangement determines its success. That's pragmatic, not emotional. Is it? Isadora's smile was knowing. Because last week when Lady Thornton made that snide comment about hasty marriages, you didn't defend me strategically. You defended me with genuine anger. I saw it in your eyes, Cassian. You were furious on my behalf, not just annoyed that someone questioned your judgment. Lady Thornton insulted you. I won't tolerate that. Why not? If I'm merely a strategic asset, her opinion shouldn't matter beyond its social implications. But you reacted emotionally, not politically. Isadora leaned forward. I'm not trying to trap you into admitting romantic feelings you don't have. I'm simply observing that maybe your capacity for emotional connection is greater than you believe. Maybe you're not as cynical as you think. Maybe I'm exactly as cynical as I appear and you're reading too much into common courtesy. Cassian's voice came out sharper than he intended. I care about your well-being because we're married and your happiness affects mine. That's enlightened self-interest, nothing more. The shutters came down over Isadora's expression, that open warmth replaced by careful neutrality. Of course. Forgive me for overstepping. Cassian immediately regretted his tone. This was the pattern of his life. Pushing away anyone who came too close, maintaining distance even when connection might be valuable. But old habits were difficult to break, and vulnerability felt like weakness he couldn't afford. I didn't mean to snap at you, he said quietly. You're not overstepping. I'm simply not accustomed to discussing emotions, or having anyone notice mine. I've noticed. Isadora stood, gathering her book. I should let you rest. You have another early session tomorrow. Isadora, wait. Cassian rose as well, catching her hand before she could retreat to her bedroom. I'm not good at this. At intimacy or emotional openness, or any of the things that come naturally to other people. But that doesn't mean I don't value what we're building. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. What are we building, Cassian? We agreed this was a practical arrangement. But sometimes it feels like more than that, and I'm not sure if I'm imagining it or if you feel it too and won't admit it. I don't know, he admitted, the words feeling like pulling teeth. I don't know what this is becoming. I know it's different from what I intended. More complicated, more significant, but I don't have better words than that. Isadora studied him for a long moment, and he felt uncomfortably exposed under her gaze. Finally, she squeezed his hand gently. That's honest enough for now. Good night, Cassian. She left him standing in the sitting room, brandy forgotten, wondering when exactly he'd lost control of this carefully constructed arrangement, and why that loss of control didn't alarm him as much as it should. The invitation arrived during breakfast 2 weeks later, elegant cardstock bearing the Hartley family crest. Edmund and Lady Pembroke, now Viscountess Hartley having married with almost indecent haste, were hosting a ball to celebrate their union. The Duke and Duchess of Greystone were cordially invited to attend. Cassian read the invitation with raised eyebrows. Bold of him, extraordinarily bold. Or desperate. Isadora set down her teacup, her expression thoughtful. He needs to rehabilitate his reputation. Inviting us suggests he's confident enough in his new marriage to face us publicly. Foolish enough to believe we'll decline, and he can frame our absence as fear of confrontation. Cassian tapped the invitation against his palm. What do you think? Shall we attend? Should we? I assumed you'd refuse automatically. I never refuse opportunities to make strategic statements, and our appearance would certainly make a statement. Cassian leaned back, considering. We'd be demonstrating that we're unbothered by his marriage. We'd be showing society that we're secure enough in our position to be gracious, and Edmund's smugness when we walk through his door would be immensely satisfying to destroy. Isadora laughed. a genuine sound of amusement. You want to ruin his evening. I want to remind him what he lost. Cassian smiled, sharp and predatory. He'll spend the entire evening watching us together, seeing how well we suit each other, recognizing what a catastrophic error he made. That's far better revenge than avoiding him. You have a vindictive streak. I prefer to think of it as a justice streak. But semantics aside, shall we attend? Yes. Isadora's eyes gleamed with something that looked like anticipation. Yes, let's attend. I'd like to see his face when we arrive. The Hartley ball was a lavish affair, clearly designed to showcase the Viscountess's wealth and Edmund's elevated status. The ballroom blazed with candles. An orchestra played from a raised platform. Champagne and elaborate refreshments circulated among guests who represented the upper echelons of London society, if not quite the absolute pinnacle. Cassian and Isadora arrived fashionably late, ensuring maximum impact. The butler's announcement of their titles caused a ripple of reaction through the assembled crowd. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. Edmund, who'd been laughing at something Lady Thornton said, went very still. "Showtime," Cassian murmured, guiding Isadora forward with his hand at her waist. Edmund recovered quickly, his social training overriding whatever emotions churned beneath his composed surface. He and his new wife approached to greet them, all polite smiles and appropriate courtesies. "Your Grace, Your Grace." Edmund bowed precisely. "We're honored by your attendance. Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," Cassian said smoothly. "Congratulations on your marriage, Hartley. I hope you'll both be very happy." "I'm certain we will be." Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. "May I introduce my wife, Viscountess Hartley, though of course you knew her as Lady Pembroke." The new Viscountess curtsied, her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. Cassian remembered her preening satisfaction at the Ashworth ball, how she'd deliberately positioned herself as Isadora's replacement. Now faced with Isadora elevated to Duchess while she remained mere Viscountess, all that satisfaction had curdled into poorly hidden resentment. "Lovely to see you again, Lady Hartley," Isadora said with perfect graciousness. "What a beautiful ball. You've done an excellent job with the arrangements." "Thank you." The Viscountess's response was clipped. "Though, of course, I'm sure it doesn't compare to events at Greystone House." "Each hostess has her own style," Isadora replied diplomatically. "Variety makes London's social season interesting." They moved away after appropriate pleasantries, and Cassian felt Isadora relax slightly against his side. That was uncomfortable. It was necessary. We've now established that we can be in the same room as the Hartleys without drama. Cassian guided her toward the refreshment table. The rest of the evening is simply maintaining that appearance while enjoying their discomfort. And discomfort it clearly was. Edmund's eyes tracked them throughout the ball, his attention returning again and again to where Cassian and Isadora danced, conversed with other guests, or simply stood together with the ease of a well-matched couple. The contrast with Edmund and his new wife was stark. While Cassian and Isadora moved through the evening with natural synchronicity, Edmund and the Viscountess seemed constantly out of step with each other. Halfway through the evening, Edmund approached Cassian in one of the quieter antechambers, where gentlemen gathered to escape the ballroom's heat. "Your Grace, a moment of your time." Cassian gestured permission, curious about what Edmund wanted badly enough to seek private conversation. "I want to understand something." Edmund's polished veneer had cracked slightly, revealing the angry man beneath. "Why her? You could have married anyone. Why did you choose my cast-off?" "Your cast-off," Cassian repeated the phrase with dangerous quiet. "Is that how you see Isadora?" "That's what she is. I rejected her, and you swooped in to claim the remains. Why? Pity? Some misguided sense of chivalry? Or just to humiliate me?" Cassian set down his glass with deliberate care. "You fundamentally misunderstand what happened, Hartley. I didn't claim your cast-off. I recognized value you were too blind to see. Isadora isn't less because you rejected her. You're less because you lost her. She's nobody, barrister's daughter with a modest dowry, and no significant connections. I did her a favor by proposing in the first place. And yet that nobody is now Duchess of Greystone, while your bride is merely a Viscountess." Cassian smiled coldly. Tell me, Hartley, how does Lady Pembroke's money taste? Is it sweet enough to compensate for the intelligence, grace, and genuine quality you traded it for? Edmund's hands clenched into fists. You don't know anything about my marriage. I know you're already regretting it. I can see it in how you watch Isadora and me together, how you compare your wife's vapid conversation to Isadora's engaging mind, how you're realizing that money without substance is a remarkably poor foundation for happiness. Cassian leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper only Edmund could hear. You had something valuable and you destroyed it for profit. That's not pragmatism. That's greed. And now you're stuck with the consequences while watching someone else enjoy what should have been yours. I could ruin her reputation again. One word in the right ears. Try it. Cassian's tone could have frozen flames. Try spreading rumors about my wife and discover exactly how much power a duke commands versus a viscount. I'll destroy you, Hartley. Not financially, though I could do that easily enough. Not socially, though that's equally simple. I'll destroy you slowly, systematically, ensuring everyone understands why you're being dismantled. Every secret you've ever tried to hide will surface. Every questionable decision will be examined. Every suspicion about your brother's death will be investigated with resources you can't imagine. By the time I'm finished, you'll wish you'd never heard Isadora Kingsley's name. Edmund had gone pale. You're threatening me. At my own ball. I'm educating you about boundaries. There's a difference. Cassian straightened, his expression returning to mild courtesy. Enjoy your marriage, Hartley. I certainly intend to enjoy mine. He left Edmund standing there and returned to the ballroom, where Isadora was dancing with some junior minister who clearly didn't interest her. Cassian cut in smoothly, pulling her into his arms for the waltz currently playing. Everything all right? She asked, noting something in his expression. You look like you want to hit someone. Edmund cornered me, said some remarkably stupid things about you. Cassian guided her through the turn, their bodies moving together with practiced ease. I may have responded with threats that would horrify my solicitor. What kind of threats? The systematic destruction of his life and reputation if he attempts to damage yours again. Isadora's eyes widened. That's extremely protective. Yes, well, apparently I'm more emotionally invested in this arrangement than I initially calculated. Cassian met her gaze. You were right, that night in our sitting room. I do care. More than I intended. More than is strictly strategic. Cassian, let me finish. He pulled her slightly closer. Propriety be damned. I've spent my entire adult life avoiding emotional vulnerability. I've built walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate them. But somehow, without me noticing, you've gotten past those defenses, and instead of being alarmed, I find I'm relieved. Relieved? To discover I'm not as emotionally dead as I believed, that I can care about someone beyond calculating what they offer me, that maybe, possibly, I'm capable of something approaching the affection I've always dismissed as weakness. He spun her through another turn. I don't know if that will ever become love, Isadora. I'm not sure I'm capable of that emotion. But it's more than respect, more than strategic partnership, it's something. Tears gleamed in her eyes, though she was smiling. Something is enough for now. More than enough. They finished the dance in silence, words unnecessary for what passed between them. Around them, the Hartley ball continued its course, guests gossiping and dancing and playing their endless social games. But for Cassian, the world had narrowed to this moment, this woman, this unexpected shift in his carefully controlled existence. He'd entered this marriage expecting partnership without passion, convenience without connection. Instead, he'd found something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable. The possibility that his cynicism about love might have been protective armor rather than accurate assessment. The remaining weeks of the season passed in a blur of social obligations and gradual domestic intimacy. Cassian found himself spending more time in their shared sitting room, drawn there by Isadora's presence, even when he had work that could be done elsewhere. They read together in companionable silence, discussed political developments with the ease of long-time colleagues, and gradually stopped maintaining separate bedrooms. That transition happened so naturally that Cassian couldn't identify when exactly it occurred. One evening he'd fallen asleep in Isadora's bed after an extended conversation. The next morning his belongings had migrated to her room without conscious decision from either of them. Within a week his former bedroom had been converted to a private study, the connecting door left open to symbolize the barrier they'd stopped maintaining. Physical intimacy followed emotional connection with surprising ease. The clinical arrangement Cassian had anticipated never materialized. Instead, they discovered genuine passion born from intellectual compatibility and growing affection. Isadora's warmth melted the last of his carefully maintained distance. Her laughter filled spaces in his life he hadn't realized were empty. Her intelligence challenged him in ways he'd never experienced, and her acceptance of his limitations, the parts of himself he couldn't change or fix, gave him permission to stop performing perfection and simply be human. 6 months into their marriage, Isadora announced she was pregnant. Cassian received the news with complex emotions: satisfaction at having secured the succession, concern for her well-being, and unexpected joy that surprised him with its intensity. "You're pleased," Isadora observed, watching his face as he absorbed the information. "Genuinely pleased, not just strategically satisfied." "I am," Cassian admitted, pulling her into his arms with uncharacteristic demonstrativeness. "Though I'm also terrified. What if I'm terrible at this? What if I can't give our child the warmth they need? Then we'll figure it out together, just like we figured out everything else." Isadora tilted her head back to look at him. "Besides, you're far more emotionally available than you believe. Our child will be fine. Our child will be spoiled rotten if I have anything to say about it." Cassian pressed a kiss to her forehead. "The heir to Greystone, and hopefully several spares to follow. You've fulfilled your end of our bargain remarkably efficiently." "Is that all this is? Fulfilling bargains?" "You know it's not." Cassian pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I love you, Isadora. I know I don't say it often enough. I know I'm still uncomfortable with romantic language and grand gestures. But I love you, not because you're convenient or strategic or useful, because you're you, and somehow that became the most important thing in my world." Tears streamed down her face, though she was smiling. "I love you too. Even though you're impossible and cynical and refuse to admit when you're wrong about things. I'm frequently wrong about things. I was catastrophically wrong about love being weakness and emotional connection being liability." Cassian wiped her tears gently. "You've taught me that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, that caring doesn't make me foolish, that maybe, possibly, romantic idealists aren't entirely delusional." "Just mostly delusional? Let's not go overboard." But he was smiling too, that rare, unguarded expression she'd learned to cherish. "I still believe practical foundations matter more than passion. I still think most people confuse infatuation with love. But I also believe that when you find someone who sees through your defenses and values what's underneath, that's worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth building a life around." That almost sounded romantic. "Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation." They stood together in the morning light filtering through the windows of Greystone House, two people who'd entered marriage expecting nothing beyond practical arrangement, and found instead the kind of partnership that transcended transaction. It wasn't the fairy tale Isadora had once imagined. It was better, built on honesty rather than illusion, strengthened by reality rather than weakened by it. Outside, London continued its endless social dance. Edmund Hartley's marriage had indeed proven unsatisfying, the Viscount's regret visible to anyone who cared to look. Lady Pembroke's money couldn't compensate for genuine connection, and society had noticed the growing distance between them. Meanwhile, the Duke and Duchess of Greystone had become one of the Tun's most solid couples, their partnership admired even by those who'd initially doubted it. Cassian stood with his wife in their home, contemplating the unexpected path that had led them here. He'd set out to correct an injustice, to provide strategic advantage to someone who deserved better than society's judgment. Instead, he'd found something far more valuable. Proof that his cynicism about love had been partial blindness rather than clear sight. Love existed. Connection mattered. And sometimes, just sometimes, practical arrangements could transform into passionate partnerships when both parties were brave enough to let them. "What are you thinking?" Isadora asked, noting his distant expression. "That I should thank Edmund Hartley." At her surprised look, Cassian elaborated. "If he'd been the man he pretended to be, if he'd valued you appropriately, you'd be his Viscountess now instead of my Duchess. His cruelty freed you to accept my proposal. His loss became my gain." "That's remarkably magnanimous of you." "Not magnanimous, honest." Cassian pulled her close again, savoring her warmth against him. "Though I have no intention of actually thanking him, let him stew in his regrets. He earned them." "And us? What did we earn?" "Each other. Against all odds and contrary to every expectation." Cassian smiled, that expression soft with genuine emotion. "I'd say we made out rather well in this transaction, wouldn't you?" "Best deal I ever negotiated," Isadora agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him, "even if it started as the strangest proposal in history. Especially because of that. Anyone can have a conventional romance, Miss Kingsley. Duchess Greystone." "Duchess Greystone," he corrected with a smile. "Anyone can have conventional romance. We built something more durable, a partnership that started with truth and grew into love without ever losing its foundation. That's worth more than 1,000 romantic gestures and pretty promises." They stood together as morning brightened into afternoon, as their life together continued its course from strategic alliance towards something neither had anticipated, but both had earned. And if anyone had told them, on that night when Cassian first proposed his calculated arrangement, that they would eventually find genuine love within their practical marriage, neither would have believed it. But that, Cassian reflected, was the beautiful irony of their story. Sometimes the most cynical arrangements could produce the most genuine connections. Sometimes admitting you couldn't offer love created space for love to develop naturally. And sometimes, just sometimes, two people who started as strategic partners could become the partnership neither knew they needed. Behind them, Greystone House stretched into the distance, rooms filled with their shared history and future possibilities. Ahead lay years of partnership, parenthood, and continued growth. And between them, in this moment, lay the simple truth that practical foundations built from honesty could support structures more beautiful and enduring than romantic illusions ever could. It wasn't the fairy tale. It was better. It was real. Dear listeners, we've reached the end of Cassian and Isadora's journey from strategic alliance to genuine love. If you enjoyed hearing how the Duke of Greystone discovered that his cynicism about romance was really just armor protecting a heart capable of deep feeling, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to Echoes of Romance. Your subscriptions help us bring you more stories of unexpected love and unconventional partnerships. Please leave us a comment telling us what you thought of this tale. Did you believe in Cassian's transformation? Did Isadora's strength resonate with you? We love hearing your thoughts, and they help us understand what stories speak to your hearts. And don't forget to hit that like button and activate your notifications so you never miss when we share our next romantic journey. Whether it's Regency ballrooms or modern meeting rooms, forbidden love or second chances, Echoes of Romance brings you stories where love finds a way, even when the path seems impossible. Thank you for spending this time with us, dear listeners. Until our next story, may you find partnerships built on honesty and love that exceeds all expectations.